Anthony Joseph Maskell was born in 1939 and died in 2001. He was an American Catholic priest working in Baltimore, Maryland in the US of A. Maskell was removed from ministry duties in 1994 following somewhat of an avalanche of accusations of sexual abuse being made against him by students of the schools in the surrounding areas and in which he served as a counsellor in the years of 1967 to 1975. Maskell was ordained in 1965 at the age of 26. In April 2023, the Maryland Attorney General released a report on the sexual abuse of children within the Archdiocese of Baltimore. The report highlighted 156 brothers and priests as being accused of the abuse of children, with over 600 cases of abuse being investigated, some dating as far back as the 1940s. Naturally, the cases most likely exceed this number, as many victims would have been dead by the time this report was put together. According to Johnny Cerrucci's worthwhile book, The Eaters of Children, Maskell was accused of assault as far back as the 1950s. Most commonly accepted as Maskell's earliest known allegation of sexual abuse occurred in 1966, 1 year following his being ordained as a priest, with many sources highlighting the Archdiocese's awareness of the incidents and the lack of criminal charges following it. A mountain of a problem which seems to be baked into these reports is the fact that the reports are not released to the public in a warts and all fashion. Instead, they are put through a summary process and then made available to the public. This was the case with the Baltimore report, and it will be seen again in subsequent reports in Ireland. The outcome of this 1966 allegation led to no disciplinary action being taken against Maskell. He was allowed to continue his ministry and would eventually, following additional allegations, be moved to different parishes, which are par for the course in these rotten cases. And this is the organisation's MO, the Catholic Church's MO, of just moving perpetrators or alleged perpetrators from parish to parish. Following Maskell's life brings us to Archbishop Keogh's High School. And this is central to most of the allegations made against Maskell. These are said to have occurred during his time there, where he served as the chaplain and school counsellor between the years of late 1960s and the 1970s. Around 39 women who were students at the time Maskell was working in the school came forward and accused him and others of abusing them. Many claimed that Maskell used his position as a priest and counsellor to manipulate, intimidate, and coerce them into staying quiet about the abuse. As noted by the report, there were said to be 156 brothers and priests implicated in the abuse. However, the web seemed to have spread further than simply the clergy, for Maskell's influence bled out past the walls of his office and into influential offices of society. Alongside being the chaplain for the high school, he was also the chaplain for the Baltimore City Police, County Police, State Police, and the Air National Guard. This predatory infection will be seen in case after case of similar filth, not limited to single countries or bound by any borders. It is said that misery loves company. Let it also be understood that predators need protection, and this protection is gained through implicating others and using this as a layer of self-preservation. Protected by familial ties and predatory crimes, Maskell had a brother who was a Baltimore police officer, and one of Maskell's victims, Jean Weiner, offered that Maskell had included his brother in the sexual abuse of her. The Netflix documentary The Keepers offered victims' accounts of being raped by several police officers, with Jean Weiner suggesting that she was once taken to a wooded area where she was abused by multiple officers. An additional victim of Maskell alleged that she would be taken on police runs with Maskell, and during these she would be assaulted by police officers in front of the priest. Imagine that. The pillars of your society, priests, teachers and the police, joining in the rape and the abuse of you. How safe would you feel? Additional priests were also implicated in the abuse. And as the world has now recently found out, these monsters use their own and others' perversions as a way of staying protected. Maskell was said to have had one student, a Lillian Nip, document the details of Maskell's perversions. Victims have alleged that Nip was present during the abuse and would be documenting what was happening, with some also accusing her of having taken photographic evidence of the abuse. It has also been suggested that some of the subjects of her recordings were public figures. Nip has declined this. She's rejected this. One Father Neil Magnus was also a co-accused, and he died in 1988, having never been criminally charged. There were reports by some of the survivors that they would be drugged, sometimes with the drinks they were offered or in the food that they were given by Maskell and Magnus. They claimed that they would be given pills or injections which would lead them to losing consciousness. Neil Magnus enters this story via Jean Wayner's allegations. She recalled that she had went to confession with Magnus and reported sexual abuse she had endured at the hands of a family member. Magnus was the Keogh School's religious services director, and using his position and the girl's faith, advised that he would need to see the girl face to face following confession to aid in the forgiveness process. She recalls him telling her that he was unsure if God can forgive such a thing. He added, as all of these monsters tend to do, that she had brought the abuse on herself. After several assaults, Maskell began to join Magnus in his attacks on Jean. She added that both priests would pray in Latin during the attacks and would ejaculate on her and command her to receive the Holy Spirit. Reading from Cerrucci's Eaters of Children, we find some witness testimony, and this is from Donna Vandenbosch. Quote, "I would be in class, and it could be any time. I'd hear my name over the loudspeaker, report to my office now, and I would have to report to Maskell. I remember being in class just crying, 'Don't make me go, don't make me go.' And the teacher pulled me out in the hall and said, 'We all know he's a weirdo, but you have to go.'" Jean Wayner said she went to see Father Neil Magnus, the school's religious services director, for confession when she was 14 years old, because she'd been feeling guilty about sexual abuse she experienced as a young child. The priest turned to her in the confessional, quizzed her on the details of the abuse, and began masturbating as she talked, she said. After that, Maskell and Magnus would call her into the offices for joint counselling sessions, which they said was for the purpose of helping her find God's forgiveness for what she did as a child. She says they would masturbate in front of her, take nude photos of her, and force her to perform sex acts as part of her spiritual healing process. Soon Maskell began calling Wayner out of class and into his office without Magnus, she said. He would show her pornography, tell her that he was trying to help God forgive her for the abuse she suffered as a child, and rape her. He kept saying it didn't seem like I was open to the Holy Spirit and God's grace, Wayner said. I was just doing what I was being told, thinking I must be such a horrible person that God can't forgive. And that's from a Huffington Post article. Also included in the accusations was a brother named Tom Whelan, a Christian brother. He was linked to the abuse at the school, and he died in 1990. There were other members of the teaching faculty, alongside school staff, who were accused of covering up the abuse. Outside of the school, the accusations fell on the lap of a gynecologist, Dr. Christian Richter. Teresa Lancaster accused Dr. Richter of being present during and participating in the abuse she suffered by Maskell. In another Huffington Post article, several women accused Maskell of running a prostitution ring. Reading from the Huffington Post article, quote, "Several of the women who spoke to the Huffington Post about Maskell's abuse described the priest setting up what amounted to a full-on brothel. Wayner said that during her senior year, Maskell began driving her to St. Clement Church, where he preached after school, and that a string of men abused her in his office there. She does not know who the men were, but they were referred to each other by generic names, Brother Ed, Brother Ted, and Brother Bob. She said some of the men gave Maskell money in exchange for the abuse. He was prostituting us," Wayner said. It has been claimed that Maskell had Richter, the gynecologist, screen the girls to assure that none of them were getting pregnant. Lancaster claims that when brought to Richter for a pregnancy test, She was raped by Maskell as the doctor fondled her breasts. Reading again from the Huffington Post, we find, quote, Maskell's trips to the gynecologist reflected a fixation with the practice. Lancaster, a victim, said he liked to perform pelvic exams on the altar of the school chapel and administer vaginal douches, enemas and anal suppositories in the bathroom of his office and in the rectory. Multiple other girls also said that they were on the receiving end of the mock gynecological exams and enemas. It was a way to establish further authority over the girls, the creation of a doctor-patient relationship, while acting out whatever fetish inspired the abuse. He was also said to have raped some of the victims in the school chapel altar. Help in these situations, as many people worldwide and many people in Ireland are only too familiar with, was far from within reach in regards to much of the faculty or the clergy, whether they be priests or nuns. One victim, Donna van den Bosch, recalled telling one nun of the abuse she was suffering, but remembers being dismissed by the holy woman. However, Jean Weiner offered that Sister Cathy Cesnik, a younger nun and an English teacher at the school, asked her one day if the priests were hurting her, to which Jean nodded. Cathy was said to then tell Jean that she, Cathy, would help and sort out the situation. Another young girl, Cathy Hobeck, claimed that Cathy would make excuses for the young girl so that she would not have to go to the priest's office. Cathy would ultimately end up dead, said to have suffered a blunt force trauma to her skull. Jean Weiner claimed that Maskell had brought her to a dump and showed her Cathy's body and said to Jean, "You see what happens when you say bad things about people." Jean claimed that this happened in November and that she had attempted to wipe maggots off of Cathy's face. Jean's account was ridiculed owing to the notion that maggots could not have been present, as it was November and winter time. However, maggots were subsequently found in Cathy's throat, and this added weight to Jean's claim. Maskell would be moved to different parishes, and allegations would continue to follow him throughout the 70s and the 80s, leading eventually to a civil lawsuit against him in 1992. This case was settled out of court with the Archdiocese accepting no liability. An additional allegation in 1994 was made against Maskell, which led to a temporary suspension, which following he was shortly reinstated. In all of this, there were no criminal charges against the priest. Perhaps feeling the noose tighten around his neck, in 1994 Maskell fled to Ireland, where he began working as a psychologist in Wexford. He was employed by the South Eastern Health Board between the years 1995 and 1997. He also worked in private practice as a clinical psychologist until 1998 and was known to work under the name of Thomas Maskell, implying or demonstrating that he used aliases along the way. Maskell was ordered not to perform any religious duties, which he ignored on at least one occasion. He was also told not to be working with clients under the age of 18, but it has come out that he would have been working with children and people who would have been affected by sexual abuse. This man was shielded by the church, landed in Ireland with all his history of accusations, and was hired by the government, screened by the Gardaí, and allowed to work with vulnerable people in Ireland. He was shielded by the church, both by the church and the authorities in Ireland. It has been alleged in the Netflix documentary that there were at least 2 victims of Maskell during his time in Ireland. Abby Schaub, a former student of Cathy Cesnik, expressed frustration that the HSE, the Health Board Association in Ireland, refused to release documentation to her concerning how Maskell was hired by the South Eastern Health Board in 1995. She said, quote, "Father Maskell's employment working with youngsters for the Irish Health Board after he fled a trial for sexual abuse of minors in America is cause for public concern. If there were problems in the background check system, these should be discussed and corrected." In July 2017, the HSE in Ireland opened an investigation into the employment of Maskell. However, as of October 2019, the HSE refused to offer any time frame for the investigation. They have said, however, that the investigation has been taken up by a third party, and in the 5-6 years following the 2009 19 information, that they wouldn't be offering a time frame for the investigation. One would wonder why the silence around this, why, and what about the questions that come up from this? So what was known about him prior to him arriving in Ireland? Who signed off on this? Was there any background checks, deep background checks done? And were there any favours being carried? Were there any favours being given by giving this man somewhere to flee to? He subsequently went back to America, where he died in 2001. But as people who are aware of these sorts of monsters, they don't stop. Their taste for blood, for pain, for control over other people, it does not wane. So given the fact that he spent a number of years in Ireland, it would be probably safe to suggest that there were victims in Ireland, in which case it would be great to hear from people. It'd be great to hear from people, because we must remember as well, this is going back to 1998. That's not that long ago, right? People in Ireland have a tendency to look back at the abuse of children by not just the Catholic Church, but by the whole system of government and the state apparatus, Gardaí, teachers, judges, all that sort of stuff. They tend to look back and go, it was a different time back then, right? It was a different time. People, they weren't aware of it, and that's all nonsense, right? That's just a pure defense mechanism, because 1998 is pretty late in the day, right? I remember 1998. I remember as a child being aware of pervy men, right, and recognizing dangerous situations and how to avoid them. So I was knowledgeable enough about that, and there was nothing special or different too much about me, right? So it's not a case of looking back going, well, things were different then. No, they weren't, right? That's never an excuse, or that's never a way out of these conversations, right? I'm sure in any given time, in any given era or age of human life and human experience, the idea of raping and abusing children was naturally a taboo, right? It's against human nature not to feel that is wrong, right? The same way looking at babies will make most adults smile. The counter is also true. The counter is also obvious. To abuse or hurt the child is biologically, emotionally, cognitively, intellectually, morally wrong, you know? And people, they write their own people off as backward, stupid monsters when they cast their eye and their judgment back a few decades and say, well, look, people didn't know any better back then. Well, they didn't know any better, if you have to take that argument at all, because the abuse of children was so commonplace. It was so widely understood, right? It was so widely accepted as a norm. But that doesn't mean that people didn't know it was wrong, right? So I hope if there were victims of this monster, that they found a bit of peace. Their lives have not been totally eradicated and ruined. And I hope that they found some love in their life, and they found some happiness in their life, and they're able to connect with people and share a relationship with people. I hope that not everything was taken away, right? So I will see you at the next one.